wisdom for my family too, and understanding that I guess being observant, the youngest of three kids growing up, I was always just watching everything. And, younger, I entertained the bad behavior. And as I've gotten older, it's like, okay, there's a way to change this narrative and at least plant the seed in someone's mind that there's better alternatives and outlets than the decisions we're making.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Yep, it's your favorite time of the week, and it's definitely my favorite time of the week. It is time for Leaders Talk, and as usual, I am your intrepid and increasingly balding host, Andrew Dupe, head of communications over here at Leaders Brands. Hopefully, y'all like the new look. It's definitely good for the summer in Alabama for sure. And speaking of guests, which we weren't speaking of, but we're going to speak of now. I have with me today Manuel Aragon. So let me introduce you to Manuel. Manuel has elite expertise in tax preparation, accounting, finance, cash planning, tax strategy, all of the above. And what he's done is he's developed a modern, innovative financial solution that drives growth and efficiency to multiple companies in Colorado. His leadership and approach has solidified a reputation for excellence, onboarding, and overall client satisfaction. He continues to serve in multiple roles across the front range as a tax preparer, CFO, operations manager, finance director, and consultant. That's a lot you're doing, and we're adding to that author.
Yes.
So, that's it's an interesting path. So, Manuel, tell me a little bit about yourself and what led you to this.
Well, I have a background in taxes. I initially started my tax business as, I guess, a side business, young kid
Yeah.
fresh out of school, trying to pay bills, and that's that typical stuff that I think young entrepreneurs go through. What led me to becoming an author is I got a 4-year-old son, so COVID kind of happened, isolation.
Mhm.
Started to, I guess, look at my life circumstances and say, okay, what do I want to leave to the world? I've always been a strong believer. What good is knowledge if you retain it? I've
Right.
spent a lot of time studying the last decade and a half, and I just want to change the approach and try to share what I've learned through my personal life experiences and try to touch as many people as possible, I think is the end goal.
Excellent. Yeah, that is an interesting journey though, from tax preparation to authorship. So what led you to even take an interest in basically the world of helping people with their taxes and helping people in general with finances?
I've naturally always been a math guy. I mean, I fell in love with numbers in first, second grade. I mean, I've always loved multiplication. I would count stop signs walking home. So that's always kind of been a natural skill set. I think what kind of led me to helping others is just my family dynamics, growing up in, I don't want to say horrible environments, but I guess environments that could have been better. And I always understood that my life bad decisions came from maybe not having the best guidance or mentorship around me at the time, or a lack of me adapting to the mentorship around me. And I don't want my son to make the same bad decisions that I did. So essentially, the thought process starts with him. And I have a lot of nieces, nephews, big family. So that's the end goal. And then just try to touch above and beyond that. I was born and raised in Denver, grew up in a church environment, but also had exposure to a lot of stuff that I frown upon today. In
Right.
my younger days, not so much. Um, but yeah, I hope that answered it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can it's definitely a fascinating journey, and yeah, I have a little bit of information about some of your background. You've made some you're able to make some really good decisions that have led you to be in a much better place. So is this kind of something that you're wanting to leave behind for people with what you're writing right now?
Definitely, I think to be involved in a book called Success DNA and participate with so many like-minded individuals. One, it's a testament to my resilience. I think. I think it's a feel-good moment for me, just understanding that, the path has been rocky, but I've always kind of kept an optimistic attitude. And I
Yeah.
think, for anybody who may be struggling, you're either glass half full, glass half empty. We could all find things to complain about, but there's so much to be thankful for every day when we wake up. So that's kind of always been my attitude.
And what when you started writing, what was kind of your end goal in mind when you very first began to write? I mean, I know you definitely helping your son and leaving some good lessons, but What really got you to the point where you felt like you had material that you felt like should be shared?
Good question. I know when I talk to people individually, people kind of gravitate towards my life story. They
Okay.
tend to, I guess, ask me more questions about my personal life. How I've been so resilient and how I've kind of gotten where I'm at,
Yeah.
especially kind of in the environments that I grew up in. So a lot of my tax clients, I tend to get a little more personal. What's your end goal? You trying to buy a house? You trying to buy a car? What's the purpose of your future, and I don't think a lot of businesses really take that approach. It's more of a service, get you in and out the door, and you charge a fee. Um, but I think to keep kind of keep it on me, it's about empowering myself, overcoming personal struggles that I'm still dealing with to this day, and also when I was younger. And then, like I said, it just revolves around the younger generation. My son is the key component of wanting to leave something other than ignorance, whether it's a book, whether it's my story, or just setting a better example, being a role model that I want him to be proud to look up to.
I mean, well, share us a little bit with our audience about your past, as much as you're comfortable with sharing. I mean, we
Yeah.
don't want to pry into every single last detail, as long as you're comfortable with it. But yeah, I mean, what exactly was it that inspired you from your personal experiences to want to make these decisions?
um well, just with my upbringing, I kind of came across a situation when I was younger where I was adapting to the neighborhood, doing things, like I said, that I'm not proud of in this moment, but it was what I learned at that time. I had caught an adult felony at age 14. I was involved in a school incident here in Colorado 4 years after Columbine. So it was taken very serious in the legal system. So, charges were very strong, and um, that's something I'll be working on more of a personal story. That'll be coming in the end of the summer. But being able to experience that and have the perception of what people think you're going through in life,
Mhm.
it's something that I wanted to change the narrative about, because it's easy to say, oh, this person's a troublemaker, this person's this person's that, but you don't really know what that person's going through, how they're feeling, what their thought process is, or what they've even been exposed to. And so, that's the intentions behind me wanting to share my story, so that maybe, people can understand why I made the decisions I made, as opposed to, drawing conclusions just based upon a newspaper article, or, something that deserves a more in-depth conversation.
Yeah. And I see exactly where you're coming from too, and it actually has a lot of application in business. And, a lot of times that I have conversations here, I've sometimes had people that had difficult pasts, or they've been in situations where they've had either failures in life or failures in business. A lot of books have that in there. And then they were able to find ways to overcome it. So, what are things that you found in yourself that you feel like managed to give you that leadership, that resilience to rather than just kind of say, "Oh gosh, I'm never going to be able to come out of this hole." People can get stuck very easily. But you made a decision, you made positive decisions that now have you sitting here in front of me and in front of an audience of thousands that are listening to your very words. So where was it that you found that in yourself?
Being in that situation as a young juvenile, isolation for anybody, I think, is self-reflective, but going through it that young, 15 and 16, it taught me who my true friends were, who my family and support systems were. It really, I guess, built a faith foundation for understanding that I have to rely on myself. I have to be self-sufficient, both emotionally, physically, and financially. And no one really laid the blueprint for me for doing that. And I think that that's what kind of is inspiration internally to maybe say, okay, if there's another kid going through this, I want to at least provide, a word of advice or something of that nature. I think understanding your identity in pivotal moments of life, whether it's losing someone that you love, or just typical stuff that I think we all experience as humans, we all handle it differently. And
Yeah.
that's the piece where we have similar circumstances, but like you said, some of us quit, some of us rise up, and in my opinion, I'm not a quitter. So, I really have no
Yeah.
choice but to move forward and I think keep a positive attitude and um, I want to be a support system for my family too, and understanding that I guess being observant, the youngest of three kids growing up, I was always just watching everything. And,
Mm.
younger, I entertained the bad behavior. And as I've gotten older, it's like, okay, there's a way to change this narrative and at least plant the seed in someone's mind that there's better alternatives and outlets than the decisions we're making.
Yeah. And that's just it. And also what you mentioned before of there being lots of different perspectives to everything. I mean, there's an old saying that when something happens, there's always three sides to a story. There's his side, the other person's side, and the truth. It's not always clear exactly which one of those comes in. So I admire that you're educating people a little bit about the thought process of what you went through when you were in kind of darker times, because I don't know if there's enough empathy that people have towards people that run into your kind of situation. So I definitely admire what you're doing to take a leadership stance with it and to be a leader and write things down. What are some things that you might be able to suggest to some people, just that may be, whether it's in a business situation where they feel like they're in trouble, or maybe their life isn't going well, maybe they're going through a divorce, maybe they're in legal trouble, maybe they're in all three. What are some things as a leader that you would say to them when they're feeling like they can't go on, they can't make the decisions they want to make anymore, they can't make an impression any longer?
I would lead with prayer. I mean, I'm a man of faith, so that would probably be number one. I think number two is have patience with yourself. No one's going to rebuild their life overnight. You have to start with small goals, whether it's waking up, an hour earlier to do something
Hmm.
positive, make your bed, like do little self gestures that I think is going to build your confidence. It starts there. And then once your confidence is at a good level, then you have to not be afraid to find outlets, ask questions, find people who have gone through similar situations and try to find them support systems. I think that's the second thing where I've kind of came out of some dark places is not
Hmm.
so much knowing how to ask the questions, but just being observant and saying, okay, this person's been through this, or I thought my life was bad until I met this person who was actually worse. So that's kind of one thing that I think when I was young is before I started to get into trouble, I walked around like, oh, my life's this, my parents, made me feel this way, my family situation's like this. But I started to meet kids my age that were in worse situations. They didn't have parents, they didn't
Hmm.
have a home. They were in and out of the system a lot more than I was. So it really started to teach me that, stop complaining and be grateful for the opportunity. I think like I said, just having that optimistic attitude as a business owner, we got to be grateful just to wake up and have the ability
Hmm.
to have all five senses. That's a blessing in itself. So
I know, yeah.
I think, start with the small things. And then as you start to build towards, the business stuff, you got to be strategic. You have to plan, you have to set goals, you have to, understand your finances, you have to pay your taxes. You can't put yourself in these situations where, you're going to get a red letter down the road and say, oh my gosh, now I got, made all this money and now I'm in a tax bill and, I'm closing my business 2 years down the road because, I
Hmm.
was arrogant and didn't handle my responsibilities.
Right. And that's, I think, well, in a lot of situations, I think that's why people write as leaders. And I've run into hundreds of authors that have said that is as much giving advice about things they can do is about telling about where you fell down along the way. And because in many ways you learn more from either you want to call it failure or setbacks or adversity in more than you do with success. Because if you have success constantly, you're right, you sometimes build up an arrogance. And I've heard that so many times. So what are ways that people can be preemptive in that situation and maybe avoid the pitfalls before they actually get there and fall into the trap, so that they don't lose their five senses, or they don't lose their business or their wife, or however it works.
That's a great question. I think that's the
Yeah.
purpose of why we read. You can empathize with other people who have been in that situation. I have developed, I think, leadership skills by reading from other leaders, whether it's through, fellow authors or someone, whether it's blogs and that's what really started to help me understand, like I said, I wasn't the only one who's been in that situation. I'm not the
Right.
only one who's had failures and experienced bad emotions. I think that's the biggest thing is when we're in these pits of life, it's easy to throw in the towel, walk away, to your point, and
Yeah.
make it as an excuse of, oh, no one's coming to save me, no one loves me, whatever the thought process is. Um, and I think it's all mental. It truly is. I think it's all mental.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree with you on that. Um, what are a few books that inspire you? Just since you mentioned
I had a feeling you were going to ask that. I read
it.
one, I read one a couple of times. It's called The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren.
Okay.
I've read that book two or three times. Great book. I've also read one recently called Stepping Up by Johnny McGowan. Um, probably two of those. They've kind of been impactful to my approach, I think, in day-to-day business. And so, I tend to read like daily motivational, inspirational, kind of faith-based, one pagers to start my day. So stuff like that, I think, has been impactful to my approach.
Yeah. That kind of ritual is definitely something that can help with people, and hopefully, your book will be on somebody's shelf here in the very near future. So tell me a little bit about the upcoming. So we've kind of covered a little bit of your anthology contribution, but so what do you have coming up?
So my upcoming book, I'm about 90% done with the manuscript. I'm getting ready to close that off in the next week. So it's going to be called The Tax of Life, Lessons from the Streets to the Boardroom.
Okay.
So that's going to be more personal based, around my upbringing. Not so much to glorify the things I've been through, but just to really kind of tell the story of how I overcame those things, my thought process in those moments, and how I got to where I'm at today is the purpose of it.
Well, and that's, I like that that's where you're going with it, because I do feel very strongly that when you're trying to help people and maybe educate them about, experiences you go through, the best way to tell is through stories. I mean, it sounds like it makes sense, but a lot of people, as a writing coach, I run into very regularly. How do I do this? Well, you just tell your story. So do you have any kind of an interesting story, just something that you can kind of preview for our audience that they might want to know? Just a little bit of an insight into you and kind of some of the things that you've gone through, and maybe something that can inspire our listeners.
Yeah, I'm blessed today, so it's hard to reflect on how I felt in those moments. But I've been through some really tough things in life. I
Yeah.
used to, kind of bounce around the neighborhood, different friend groups, peddling low-level drugs, getting in trouble, petty theft, being arrested, expelled from schools. Like I said, not really stuff that I'm super proud of, but I've done it. I got expelled in seventh, eighth, and then caught the felony charge in the ninth grade. So I went through these four and a half years of just horrible decision making, and it really took that consequence of 2 years being isolated for me to change my thought process, for me to look at the man in the mirror and say, okay, stop blaming the people around you and start taking accountability for the actions you're making. Um, and I think that kind of leads into, when I was younger, I always heard the thought process of people saying, you make mistakes, you make mistakes. And I changed my thought process around that, where we don't make mistakes, we make bad decisions. They're not mistakes. We're humans. We know right from wrong. So, it's like a kid with a cookie jar when we're young. Mom tells you don't get in the cookie jar, you get in the cookie jar, and she's like, "Did you get the cookie?" And you hide your hand. And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
it's that natural conscience. So I think, that's where I don't say I made mistakes now at this point in my life. I made bad decisions.
Yeah.
And, I think those bad decisions have learned to lessons, and lessons learn to growth. So that's kind of my thought process on that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Yeah, and a mistake is more when you think something is the right decision and you make that decision and you realize it wasn't. It's
Yeah.
that tends to be a mistake. But you're right. When you're running into the kind of situation you are, they're bad decisions. You run into them. You know there's a wrong way to go. You do it because it's easy, or you do it because it's the only thing that makes sense, or you do it because you're desperate. I've made bad decisions. I think everybody has made them. So I like exposing that. I think that's a really valuable thing for our audience to think about in the differentiation between the mistake and the bad decision, and that can serve very well in business too. So Manuel, how can our audience find out a little bit more about you?
I mean, you can follow me on Facebook. It's just Manuel Aragon. I have the Instagram handle too, Manuel Aragon _ Aragon Tax Services. So them are probably the two quickest ways to follow me is on social media. Or
Perfect.
my website is just www.aragontaxreturnservices.com for anybody looking for tax prep, bookkeeping, or accounting services. So we're looking to expand nationwide over the next year and a half while simultaneously, releasing the books. And then I'll be participating on an upcoming uh, documentary that we'll be announcing here in a couple of months for the fall. So that should be fun as
Perfect.
well.
Yeah, and we'll discuss that. We'll have you back when we don't do a deep dive into your book, and we'll talk about that then. But until then, Manuel, fascinating stuff. I think that there's a lot of valuable stuff for the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, those links are down below, as well as links to purchase Manuel's books. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate having you, and we're going to talk again very soon.